This lecture introduces you to the perspective of the behaviourist theorists with a particular focus on classical and operant conditioning. The purpose of introducing this material is to further the reading in the Hoffnung text and to allow you to be able to apply this theoretical material to parenting and attachment. The objectives for this session are for you to be able to understand and explain classical conditioning processes, operant conditioning processes, various concepts of reinforcement and how they're used, and the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment, which a lot of people confuse. There are three people that are involved in this particular paradigm of human development, and that is Pavlov, who some of you may have studied at school, who furthered our understanding of classical conditioning; Watson, who was a psychologist that came slightly after Pavlov, who also focused on classical conditioning; and Skinner, whose understanding of reinforcement formed the basis of his theory of learning, which was based on principles of operant conditioning. So basically the behaviourists all had one thing in common, and that was that they believed that all behaviour was learnt and came from the environment. The behaviourist school believed that people have no free will and that a person's environment alone determines their behaviour. They believed that we learn new behaviour through classical or operant conditioning processes. One of the characteristics of the behaviourist school was that they were also trying to demonstrate that psychology was a science, and in order to do that they could only really report on observable or external behaviour and claim that it could be objectively and scientifically measured. They didn't have any regard for the processes of internal events such as thinking or emotion or any of those other unconscious or more observable psychological processes. They actually believed that there was little difference in the learning that took place in humans and in other animals. So Pavlov's classical conditioning concept came from looking at dogs and identifying that if you paired a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, you could basically elicit a conditioned response from what was, after conditioning, a conditioned stimulus. So basically in Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus was the fact that dogs salivate when they're exposed to food. So it was the response which was the salivation, and the stimulus was the dog meat, and that was an automatic response. And during conditioning, the presentation of the food or the unconditioned stimulus was paired with a bell, and eventually, after repeated pairings, Pavlov could just ring the bell because the original neutral stimulus had become a conditioned stimulus. And we all experience this particular phenomena if we are driving along in our cars and hear an ambulance or a siren, and we automatically pull over to the side of the road. There was a time when we didn't know what that bell meant because we weren't conditioned to the sound of it, but now that we are, our response to that is to pull over. Your textbook gives some examples of how this applies to infancy on page 45, and how the sight of a bottle can be conditioned with a baby very quickly in life, just as an instinctual thing, when they understand that the sight actually means food and they start to suck, and that's the conditioned response. That doesn't happen automatically. That isn't present at birth. That is something that they learn in the first couple of weeks of life, and it can apply to the mother's breast as well as the sight of a bottle. There's further examples given on page 147 of your textbook, and it's talking about infants who are repeatedly exposed to particular stimuli, particularly comforting stimuli, and how they learn to respond warmly to that, so that they eventually learn to attach to the primary caregiver. Watson followed on Pavlov's experiments by applying this particular phenomenon of classical conditioning to inducing fear in another person. Unfortunately, he chose a child, and you can read about that in your textbooks. It's the sort of research that wouldn't be done today because of the consequences to the child of inducing a fear like that. That sort of thing can happen anyway if the child gets a fright. But in pairing the association of an animal with a loud noise and making the small infant scared of animals, we would just see that as child abuse today. So it's another one of those dark experiments in psychology. What Watson did do, though, was give us insight into how phobias and fears develop in people. And he proposed that behaviour could be controlled via stimulus and response associations, and that those associations increased with age, and he furthered the work of understanding and treating phobias. But as I said, his methods violated the human rights and ethics of today. Watson's work also explains positive associations as well, why some things or sights or smells or sounds invoke very warm feelings within us because we've associated it with something positive, and sometimes that takes us by surprise. Skinner was a theorist who furthered this work by coming up with an idea of operant conditioning, which is all based around the idea of reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is when we give something positive to facilitate a desired response, and getting a merit award, getting encouragement of any kind, getting a smile, getting attention, all of those sorts of things are positive reinforcement. We can apply those concepts to parenting or instructing or teaching other people, and that increases the likelihood that the behaviour that we're trying to condition will continue. Negative reinforcement, instead of giving something positive, we remove something undesirable through taking away something unpleasant. And this is in order to seek the desired response. So, for example, the hotel environment to someone who's alcohol dependent, it's recommended that they stay away from that particular negative reinforcer, because the person who is trying to give up alcohol associates the setting with pleasant feelings, taking away the craving of wanting a drink. And the environment itself acts as a negative reinforcement. So the likelihood that the person might start drinking again is increased if they walk into a hotel. Your textbook gives other examples of operant conditioning and negative reinforcement as applied to the behaviour of infants. So one of the examples that's given is if we are in a car where an alarm goes off if you don't buckle up your seatbelt. So that's basically negatively reinforcing your behaviour. It's making sure that you buckle up, because until you do, the annoying alarm will not go off. But when it does, you're buckled up, so you're likely to buckle up next time. So that's very different from punishment, which tries to stop the behaviour continuing. Negative reinforcement actually ensures that the behaviour continues. You can think of other examples when it comes to dealing with people. Some people believe that if you have a child who is constantly interrupting you and demanding your attention, if as a parent you give them that attention and you allow yourself to be interrupted, then you're negatively reinforcing that child's behaviour, because you're taking away their need to be noticed, and you're doing that to your own detriment, and I guess socially to theirs as well. So it's an interesting concept to think about, but it does take a while to get your head around it and to fully understand it. Both positive and negative reinforcement increase the likelihood that a behaviour, whether desirable or undesirable, will occur again. So with negative reinforcement, the negative reinforcer itself will ensure that the behaviour continues. And some authors called Barron and Kalshner in 2009 give the example of if you are a victim of the snooze button and you have a habit of turning off the snooze button if you set yourself an alarm. The fact that if you really have to get somewhere on time, what we tend to do is move either the phone or the alarm clock or whatever it is away from the bed and away from your hand, so you can't turn it off and fall back to sleep, so you actually have to get up. So it takes away your possibility of being late, therefore it negatively reinforces your behaviour and makes sure that you are on time. Another example that's given is any sort of substance use for pain, even a basic Panadol. If you have a headache and you take a couple of Panadol and it works, the chances are, because it takes away the pain of a headache, and remember negative reinforcement takes away something unpleasant, then the chances are that you'll take another Panadol the next time you have a headache. Or if something else works for you, like an ice pack, if it's a tension headache, then the next time you get a pounding headache, you might ensure that you lie down for half an hour, because that's a negative reinforcer too. It makes it likely that that's what you'll use to take away the pain you're experiencing. Punishment, though, is different. Instead of strengthening a desired response, it weakens it or suppresses the response by adding an unpleasant stimulus or removing a pleasurable one following the response's occurrence. You can see in the next little clip some examples of positive and negative punishment, and your textbook goes into that as well. So you might add a responsibility as a consequence if a child breaks the rules, for example, if you're parenting, or you might take away something that they value, and that would be negative punishment. But either way, what you're hoping to do is decrease their behaviour in some way. Extinction is the removal of the response completely, and this is best done by either ignoring a response or reinforcing an alternatively desirable behaviour, and that's something that usually happens when you're teaching younger children morality, for example. Shaping is actually how the process of operant conditioning works in terms of learning and in terms of its application to how children learn. If you look at the example of infants, we usually reinforce small changes in behaviour in order to get them to eat with implements. So it might be a spoon or a fork or their hands in a clean and hygienic way. It might be chopsticks, but normally we do it in small steps, and as they learn one skill, we'll teach them another. And finally, in Western society, it's to use a knife to cut items. And that's all done by shaping, in other words, reinforcing small changes to bring it closer to the goal. So here you can download the PowerPoint presentation and click on this clip if you like to further up these concepts. The last person I'm just going to briefly mention, because some of you may want to look at Bandura in your essays, is that in association with the learning theorists, Bandura developed a social cognitive theory, which was again about the way that children learn. So he agreed with the principles of operant conditioning and reinforcement, but he also introduced the element of cognitive appraisal. In other words, that people think about what they do and the consequences of their actions before they do it, under ideal circumstances. So he contributed to our understanding of modelling behaviour, imitating behaviour, and he also contributed to our understanding of what we call vicarious reinforcement. So in other words, how children learn from watching the experiences of other people, and in fact how many of us learn some experiences vicariously by watching what other people go through, not necessarily having that experience ourselves. So Bandura brought a new dimension to learning theory, and it was to combine some of the principles of the traditional behaviourist view with a cognitive element, and we call that appraisal. So he contributed to the debate by explaining how human beings appraise situations and weigh them up before they actually act. So he didn't deny that a lot of it was environmental and the result of reinforcement, but he didn't actually agree. It was only that he said human beings have a remarkable capacity to make decisions about what they'll do, and they base that on the sort of modelling and imitation that they've seen in their lives as well. So some of you may be very interested in Bandura and look at some of the work he's done with modelling and violence and those sorts of concepts. So in summary, classical conditioning explains stimulus-response behaviour and is often quite useful for understanding the behaviour of infants and how they're conditioned to different things in the environment. Operant conditioning, in contrast, centres around concepts of reinforcement to change behaviour, both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Punishment is also a part of operant conditioning, and this can also be positive or negative, but punishment is a concept that is never ever used in healthcare. In healthcare, it is only reinforcement that is used to encourage changes in behaviour. Bandura extended these concepts of classical and operant conditioning to incorporate the place of cognition or thinking on learned responses. Whereas the traditional classical and operant conditioning theorists only allowed the environment in terms of what influences behaviour, Bandura said it was both the environment and the individual's ability to appraise situations that was responsible for changes in behaviour. That's the conclusion to this second part of the Module 3 lecture, and I'll catch you later. Thank you.